Hello folks, thanks for joining me at this rather messy campsite. Not my mess obviously, this was here before I got here. Somebody's been camping here only a couple of months back and they're obviously a bit of a bumper cart because they haven't cleaned up after them. They haven't left no trace, so I'm going to do their job for them. I brought a bag with me and I'll clear this up and then I'm going to hang around a bit until it gets a bit darker before I set up my stuff, because I'm overlooked by some houses over there, so it's going to be quite a stealthy one. I've brought my trusty Snugpak Ionosphere tent, which is one of the stealthiest. I haven't used it for a while, it's actually my oldest tent. I might do a bit of a review of it as well, and also one of my oldest cook sets as well, which I'll show you in a bit. But for now I better get to work. Right, filled a bag. I shall hide this behind this bush here and then obviously take it with me in the morning and try and dispose of it somewhere. I've also cleared a bit of a space here ready to put the bivvy tent, and I'm going to have a small tarp as well as a porch. But much too early yet. What time are we on? 4:20. I don't really want to start setting up until it gets dark, so that's a good hour and a half. I think though after that I deserve a bit of a coffee. So it's nice and peaceful again now. You may have heard earlier that it was really noisy because there were two lads on scramblers going up and down here. Hope they don't come back because it really was very noisy. There's a sort of bridleway just at the bottom there. Hopefully now the sun's going down they'll be going home for the tea. Right, what time are we on now? 5:20, so I'll probably give it till 6 o'clock, then I'll think about getting the tent out. Right, I'm all set up. I'll show you around in detail in the morning, but I think I'm going to start getting my tea on now because it's 7:45. I'm going to be having a lamb steak fried in a new frying pan, and I'm also going to do fried sautéed potatoes and some broad beans. Morning, folks. Right, I've had my coffee, although I've dropped a bit of a bollock this morning because I have bacon and eggs with me. They're hanging in that bag over there. But I used all the oil last night cooking my tea, so there's none left this morning. Now, I've ruined one pan on my last camp by not using any oil, and I don't want to do that with my nice new pan, so I'm going to have to go hungry until I get home. Never mind. I thought I'd just share a few thoughts about my shelter, the Snugpak Ionosphere. I'm not going to do all the specs and materials and everything of it. There's plenty of videos out there, some really good ones by the Outdoor Gear Review, long-term reviews as well. This is just my own personal thoughts on it after 6.5 years of use. In actual fact, this was my first shelter that I bought when I got into wild camping back in 2018. And for a short while I regretted the purchase a little bit because I wanted it to be a tent, and really it isn't a tent, it's much more of a large bivvy. So there were some frustrations about it which I'll come to later. But once I actually got some bigger tents a year or so later, I started to really appreciate it for what it is rather than what it isn't. So what do I like about it? Well, first of all, it's the size. The size is really useful. It's very low profile and has a small footprint. So you can pitch it in places that maybe you wouldn't get a slightly bigger tent. Despite the small footprint, it's actually quite spacious inside. I've got my winter mat and big winter sleeping bag there, and they weren't even touching the mesh inside. Plus I've got my rucksack above my head. My feet weren't touching the bottom, so it's quite clever. I know that when I've let friends or family use this, they've commented that it feels really cosy inside because it's just kind of like a cocoon without being too much like a coffin. Now, it's not for everybody. Some people get claustrophobic in there, but from my experience, I actually find it really cosy and I sleep really well in it. It's generally a good stealth camping tent because, I should say bivvy tent, because of the colour as well. The colour really does blend in UK sort of woodland situations and even on hillsides and things. So I like all that about it. Also, the pack size is nice and small. It's not necessarily the lightest. I think it's about 1.5 kilos when packed, but it does compress down in its stuff sack to a really useful size. It's fairly easy to pitch if the weather's favourable. Stands up to wind very well, I believe, although I haven't had it in very strong winds. It would make sense because the lack of surface area means that it isn't catching the wind like a sail, like a bigger tent would. Particularly if you pitch it with the foot end into the wind, it just tends to glide over it. And the amount of peg out points helps as well. There's a lot of ventilation. There's a nice gap all the way around the entirety of the tent, which does mean that condensation is less of an issue than in a lot of other tents. It seems to me pretty well made on the whole, I would say. The outer is pretty robust, well taped seams, and quite impressed by the fact that it's got DAC poles, one at the bottom and one at the front here. Now, DAC poles are what Hilleberg use, for instance, on their high-end tents. So on the other hand, what about some of the cons, some of the things I'm not so keen on? Well, first of all, the fact that it's pitched with the inner first, and the inner is all mesh. So that means if it's raining, that's going to get wet. Now, to be fair, that's a problem with much more expensive tents that are inner pitch first. So I can't necessarily blame it too much for that. But if Snugpak were to make a version 2, which pitched all together, I think it would make a lot more sense, given that it's quite a storm-worthy tent. The amount of peg out points can be seen as a plus, but I mean it is quite a daft amount. It's about 14 or so, and I'm not sure it needs to be quite that many. They could have perhaps doubled some peg out points up. It does mean that you end up carrying a fair bit of weight in pegs. That's only a minor gripe though. I think the biggest problem with it for me is the lack of any kind of porch area at all. If it's raining, great, you can get in the tent and stay nice and dry. But then if you want to cook, you're a bit knackered. When you have this door open, rain can come straight down into your tent and collect in the bathtub. It would be great if you could lie in the tent on your side and just have a little stove here just to cook yourself something. Now, I could have done that last night if it had rained because I've put a poncho tarp up. Now, that was a bit of a faff, and I was quite lucky that I could do that here with this tree. It made it quite easy, but if I was up on a hill, that would be quite tricky to do, I think. Ideally, again, there would be some kind of perhaps optional fold-out little awning that could come out here. It would only have to come out a foot or so. And you could perhaps use some lightweight poles or a couple of sticks or your walking poles or something. And then you could lie in there and just have that little covered area there to be able to just do some basic cooking. There is a slight issue I noticed in terms of workmanship. There's some perishing on one of the sleeves where the pole goes through. I'm not quite sure what's caused that. I can't work it out. But that's the only sign really of any damage of any kind over all these years. Now, I mentioned the excellent ventilation as a plus point, but it can in some circumstances be a negative. I have been inside here up on a hill in Wales, and it was a foggy evening, and it was quite weird because the fog started to creep in under the gap and into the tent. So I was lying in a foggy tent. Now that can't be good. It was quite chilly as well. So there isn't any option to sort of raise or lower that gap. It's just kind of stuck there. 9 times out of 10 you're glad of it, but there are occasions where it can be a bit much. Now, I think the biggest con today, if somebody was to buy one of these tents, is actually the price. When I bought this back in 2018, I think it was about 120 quid on Amazon. That may have been reduced from the retail a little bit. Now, I thought that was reasonable. I wouldn't have necessarily wanted to pay a lot more than that. However, now Snugpak are charging more like 220 for exactly the same tent. It's also had a name change. It's now called something like the Ionosphere WGTE. We Go to Extremes, I think it stands for. It's a really irritating Snugpak marketing thing. There's no need for it. It's the same tent. I don't think I could justify spending the money on one now, buying one new, unfortunately, unless I knew I was going to get an awful lot of use out of it. I think there's more interesting similar tents out there now, like the new One Wind bivvy tent that has a built-in awning. That looks really interesting. Snugpak are a bit of an exasperating company in my experience. I've spent a lot of money with them and their product range really varies. I've had some terrible stuff off them. Their tarp, the first tarp I bought was their all-weather shelter, and that was awful. I actually ended up giving that away. It doesn't have a standard amount of tie-out points. There isn't a tie-out point in the middle like you'd get on most tarps, and that really restricts the amount of configurations you can do. It's okay as a hammock tarp, but not much more than that. Their rucksack, the Endurance, that was my first kind of bushcrafty rucksack. Now, I kind of put up with it and thought it was okay for quite a few years, although I had lots of problems with it ripping around the edge of the lid, and my wife very kindly ended up sewing it on a couple of occasions, but it still kept ripping. But it was only when I switched to a much better designed and well-made rucksack about a year and a half ago, which is the Carrymore Sabre SF45, that I realised how uncomfortable that pack was. It really was low on my back. I couldn't seem to just get the weight distributed properly, so it was hard work. I'm well rid of that. I wouldn't recommend that one at all. However, there's some other bits of Snugpak gear that I absolutely love and I use all the time. The Ionosphere is one. I'm a big fan of their Special Forces bivvy, the one with the zip up the middle. I used that on my last camp. It's a really lovely, lightweight, tiny bivvy that does its job. And their sleeping bags, if you take their rating with a pinch of salt, their sleeping bags are generally pretty good. But anyway, back to the Ionosphere. Glad I bought it. Maybe if you can pick a good condition one up second hand, I'd recommend it. If you are going to buy one new, really think about some of the cons that I've mentioned before you take the plunge. Well, you know what, folks, I've had a bit of luck this morning because shortly after leaving the campsite, I came across the Apedale Heritage Centre, which is a sort of little museum. And not only did they have a big bin that I could put all that rubbish in, they also had a cafe, and a very kind lady there sorted me out with some vegetable oil. So that means I can now do some bacon and eggs. I'm going to do it here at this spot. And actually, it's a sort of tribute to MSI Outdoors, a local lad who's got a great channel. I'll put a link up here. And I think he's stopped here a couple of times, if I'm right, to do much the same as I'm going to do now. So I'm going to say goodbye to you now. Won't be any more talking. I'll just show you me cooking the bacon and egg butty. And I'd like to say thanks for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.